I don't know what he said, so I don't know what you're expecting. Okay. Well, thank you for having me, and I'm going to be speaking this evening on that never-ending drama, which would be funny were it not for the fact that it has entailed so much human suffering over such a protracted period for reasons which, at this point, they feel almost insane. I was reading the past couple of weeks what's called the Foreign Relations of the U.S., FRUS, the FRUS volumes on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the two volumes that dealt with the period of the first Camp David, that was 1977 to 1980, when President Jimmy Carter presided over and eventually succeeded in extracting an Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement. And it's a fairly large collection. It's 3,000 pages. I've plowed my way now through 1,800 of the 3,000 pages, and you begin to feel insane at a certain point. I knew I had crossed the threshold to certifiable lunacy when I started to have dreams of King Hussein secretly marching in the Israeli army. Some people might appreciate just how insane that is. And but the thing that really struck me is that was 1977 to 1980, which is well before many of the people in this room were even born. And Carter, at one point, he comments that he's determined to get something out of these negotiations because he said, I've spent, and you can see it's true, I've spent hundreds of hours on this. He said, to the point that it means I've sacrificed the time I should have invested on the Soviet Union, on Cyprus, on Nicaragua, and he starts listing all these world crises that he had to sideline in order to just extract this agreement to get Israel out of the Sinai, out of the Egyptian Sinai. For those of you who don't have the historic memory, when Israel launched the 1967 war, by the end, it had conquered not just the West Bank and Gaza, which is our concern today, but had also conquered the Egyptian Sinai and also conquered the Syrian Golan Heights. And so Carter managed to extract, through quite a lot of arm twisting, he managed to extract an Israeli withdrawal from the Egyptian Sinai. But already back then, hundreds of hours. And now from then, there has been, since 1980, there have been 35 more years of this insane peace process. And you can't achieve what is so perfectly obvious to be the resolution of the conflict. It just doesn't require great genius or diplomatic insight to recognize that Israel has to withdraw to its legal borders. End of story. And let Palestinians, allow Palestinians the same basic rights, minimal basic rights as anybody else, to what's called self-determination. That's it. And the big question mark is, why can't this simple solution be effected finally for once and for all, and for the rest of humanity to move on? How could it be that at that point, the greatest superpower in the world, the United States, has to devote more time to a place on the map that can pretty much fit in this room, more time than to the Soviet Union? Doesn't make any sense. And that to me is becoming the most salient aspect of this conflict. It has reached the point of certifiable insanity, and nobody is going to convince me otherwise. It's become insane. Not just the conflict, but, and I don't say this in a demagogic sense, and I don't say it in a enthusiastic sense, the country itself, Israel, has gone berserk. What is this lunatic prime minister? I'm not a patriot at all. I'm a person of the left. But even as a person of the left who has no great investment in notions of nationalism and national loyalties, even I can't help but just feel outraged that this head of state intends to barge into our country to give his lecture on Iran? Is there anyone here that thinks he knows that Netanyahu knows something about Iran that President Obama and his advisors don't know? Do we really need somebody to hold up one of his Daffy Duck Looney Tune cartoons of Iran? What is going on? What is going on? This country has gotten out of control. And I do not say that happily. And I do not say that as if it's a permanent fact. There are many countries in the modern world who took complete leave of their senses for, thank goodness, temporary periods, and managed thereafter to restore their sanity. So I retain a hope, I preserve a hope that Israel will one day gain control over its senses. However, having said that, we shouldn't kid ourselves about the fact that it's gone completely berserk. And this whole thing called a peace process has reached the point, along with the conflict itself, the process that engulfs it has become completely insane. I read the latest statement of the European Union this morning. We have to restore negotiations. We have to start up negotiations again. For what? It's been going on 50 years. Negotiations for what? We don't need to negotiate. We need to end the conflict. Negotiate what? Is there anyone who doubts what needs to be done? So why do we have to start up negotiations again? To give Blair something to do? Well, that's by way of introduction. Which is to say, honestly, it happens I'm very ill. I got a bad, I don't know, a combination of flu and hypoglycemia, which was a pretty lethal cocktail. So you're going to hear the splenetic side of me, which is not it's not the full gamut of my personality. I'm known to possess a sense of humor, and it's also true that I've been immersed in this reading project with the foreign relations volumes, which are driving me crazy. So there's an element of distortion in my personality, but I stand by every word of what I just said, and someday, historians are going to look back and really wonder what the heck happened here. And it is an interesting question. What did happen that allowed this thing to drag on and on and on? What I want to do this evening, however, is I want to go over what actually happened this past summer in Gaza, because I think it's widely misunderstood what happened, and then to talk about what, in my opinion, at any rate, is the only way to resolve the conflict. Not the goal, because I think the goal is clear, but the mechanism, the modus operandi to achieve the goal. The events this past summer, the Israeli attack that commenced on July 7th and ended on August, Could you just speak up? I don't think they're going to back and hear you. Okay. Let's see what we can do. I'll be standing, so that's not a problem. How does this work? I hear a little more of an echo. No good? Good. How about you in the back? Yes. You look like you're planning a terrorist attack. It's not the hair or the beard. No, it's not. It's your mustache. The attack that began on July 7th lasted 51 days and terminated on August 26th. It was the third Israeli assault on Gaza in a little over 5 years. In 2008-9, 2007-8, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead, and then in November 2012, Israel launched Operation Pillar of Defense. That was a shorter one of Israel's murderous assaults that lasted a week. Cast Lead lasted 22 days. and this was the third assault in a little over 5 years. And it was, of the 3 assaults in the past now 6 years, it was in the third assault, it was the most deadly, it was the most devastating, and it's had the most enduring results. The recent report of the IMF said that Gaza's economy, for the first time since 2006, it's contracted 15%, and the levels, obviously, of unemployment and everything else are off the charts at this point because the brutal siege of Gaza continues as lethally, with as much lethality as before, which is a double disaster because the siege continues, but the siege continues after the massive destruction, which means no building materials have been allowed in to repair, for example, the dwellings of 110,000 people in Gaza who were rendered homeless by the last Israeli attack. And now there are periodic reports, for example, of people in Gaza literally, not figuratively, literally freezing to death. Well, the background to the last attack, it begins in April 2014 when Hamas, the Islamic movement in Gaza, mostly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, when Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, they formed a national consensus government. Hamas, as you know, is officially a terrorist organization, and the expectation by Israel's expectation was that the US and the EU would break off relations with the new consensus government among the Palestinians. Surprisingly, the US and the EU did not break off relations with the new government. They took a wait-and-see approach. Partially, in my opinion, it was retaliation by Secretary of State Kerry and the EU, retaliation at Israel for having sabotaged Kerry's peace initiative, in which he had invested a huge amount of time. Then, on top of that surprise, on top of the surprise that the EU and the US did not break off relations, on top of that surprise, the second surprise was the new government under the authority of President Abbas reiterated its acceptance of the 3 EU conditions, or the 3, what's called quartet, the 3 quartet conditions for negotiations, namely acceptance of the conditions. 1, renunciation of violence. 2, recognition of all past agreements, acknowledgement of all past agreements, and 3, recognition of Israel. And which meant de facto, Hamas has now accepted those 3 conditions as well. If it were a sane world, you would think this would be grounds for hope and optimism. Hamas has indirectly, but nonetheless de facto, recognized Israel, renounces violence, and acknowledges past agreements. But what happened was Netanyahu, or the Israeli government, reacted in a rage. First of all, they were in a rage because, once again, Netanyahu's genius was being thrown into doubt by the US and the EU. He says Hamas is a terrorist organization. They want to destroy Israel, blah, 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 blah. And everybody is supposed to defer to his genial judgment. And they didn't. And for Netanyahu, this was the second slight, the second consecutive slight, because the EU and the US, or it's called the P5 plus 1, the negotiators with Iran, that the US and the EU effectively are negotiating with Iran, even though Netanyahu is against that, says Iran wants to destroy Israel, and blah, 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 or as your generation says, yada, 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 or that may be 2 generations ago. I'm telescoping generations at this point. And of course, the very last thing Netanyahu wants is a reasonable Hamas. That's a disaster for Israel, because the moment Hamas starts to behave reasonably, then the pressure begins to be exerted on Israel. Well, if they're being reasonable, why don't you negotiate and end the conflict? Which is the one thing Israel doesn't want. Not that it doesn't want to end the conflict, it doesn't want to end the occupation. That's the problem. And it needs an irrational, it needs a quote-unquote extremist Hamas in order to justify its gradual absorption, its incremental annexation of the occupied Palestinian territories. There's a nice phrase that was coined by an Israeli political scientist, a mainstream fellow named Avner Yaniv. He referred to these Palestinian peace offensives. That's the big problem. It's these peace offensives where the Palestinians are acting too reasonable, too moderate, and therefore they need to be sufficiently pummeled that they return to inflexible and violent tactics. Well, Netanyahu ranted and raged, why are you negotiating with Hamas? But he couldn't do very much about it until an apple dropped into his lap. A gift fell into his lap. And that gift was the abduction of the 3 Israeli teenagers in the middle of June of this past year. What we know as of now is, and what was known immediately actually, was 2 things. Number 1, the kids, the 3 teenagers, were killed almost immediately. That was known by Israel at the time. And number 2, that the Hamas leadership had not organized the abduction. There were Hamas members involved, but lower level Hamas members. It was not something that the leadership had planned or prepared. But for Netanyahu, this was an opportunity. And if you're a good politician, and I suppose Netanyahu is a good politician, I can't really tell because he fills me with such loathing. He knew this was an opportunity to carry on another agenda, namely, how do you radicalize Hamas and so delegitimize them as a credible negotiating interlocutor? And so he launched what was called Operation Brother's Keeper, allegedly to find the 3 kids, even though, as I said, it was known almost immediately that they had been killed. And they proceeded to kill a half dozen or more Palestinians, blow up several Palestinian homes, all in the West Bank, ransack businesses, and arrest about 500 Palestinians, overwhelmingly Hamas members. And the purpose was perfectly clear for anybody who wanted to see it, namely, they wanted to keep provoking Hamas into a violent reaction, so that Mr. Netanyahu can then throw up his hands in despair to the world and say, you see, I told you, they're terrorists. You can't negotiate with them. Or as he put it later to a U.S. State Department official, he said that never second guess me again when it comes to Hamas. Well, initially, Hamas resisted the provocations, but there are other factions in Gaza which didn't resist the provocations. They started firing the homemade weapons, and at some point the whole thing spiraled out of control, and the new round, or the third major assault began. When it began, for some of you may not recall now, but between the period of July 7th and July 17th, the big question was whether or not Israel would launch the ground invasion. They had begun with their usual air assault, very heroic, launching air assault against Gaza. It's about as heroic as shooting fish in a barrel. But then the question began whether to launch the ground invasion. And the ground invasion posed a significant dilemma for Israel, which it's not been able yet to figure out how to handle. And the dilemma is this. These homemade projectiles, which Hamas and the other factions, they use, these projectiles, they cannot be disabled from the air. The only way they can be disabled is if you send in a ground force to eliminate them. It was the same dilemma Israel had in 2006 when it invaded Lebanon. It could not stop the Hezbollah rocket attacks without launching the ground invasion. But the problem is this. If you launch a ground invasion, it's going to mean significant combatant casualties. And Israeli society is not tolerant of or won't abide significant combatant casualties. It's a Spartan-like society where actually a civilian casualty is seen as less a cause of lamentation than a military casualty. So the first problem is if we invade, there's a serious problem of significant combatant casualties. There's only one way to prevent significant combatant casualties. There is a way, and it takes very little imagination to figure it out. The way you prevent it is, as the army enters into, in this case, Gaza, you destroy everything in sight, everything to the right of you, everything to the left of you, and everything in front of you. And that way, the probability of combatant casualties is drastically reduced, which is what Israel did in 2008. Okay, now my memory's going. 2008-9. Yes, 2008-9, which is what Israel did during Operation Cast Lead. So if you read the orders, and there's an extensive record, the officers told the soldiers as they entered Gaza during Operation Cast Lead, just destroy everything. If you see anything move, you blow it away. It's as simple as that. And it worked quite effectively. So in Operation Cast Lead, there were 13 Israeli casualties. Of the 13, 10 were combatants, and of the 10 combatants, 4 were killed by what's called friendly fire, where Israeli soldiers accidentally killed other Israeli soldiers. So in all, it was really only 6 combatant casualties. On the Palestinian side, about 1,400 people were killed, of whom estimates are about up to 1,200 were civilians. The problem was, after Operation Cast Lead, which caused an outrage of revulsion around the world, and the threat of what was called back then the Goldstone Report, for those of you who remember it, Israel was no longer able to get away with committing massive death and destruction on the order of Gaza, because, on the order of Cast Lead, because the international community said no. That was the message of the Goldstone Report. So the dilemma Israel faced was, if you invade Gaza, and there are a large number of civilian casualties, you have a domestic problem. If you invade Gaza and you commit too much death and destruction, you have an international problem. So what do you do? And Netanyahu held off until a new gift dropped in his lap. And that gift, I don't have time to go through all the details, but the main gift that fell in his lap, the main gift was the downing of the Ukrainian airliner, the downing of the Malaysian airliner over the Ukraine. Now, some of you might say that's a little bit far-fetched. What could one possibly have to do with the other? But in fact, they have everything to do with each other. That's the nature of politics, because a lot of politics is played out in the public media and in the public realm. And Netanyahu, the current prime minister, in 1989, for those of you who remember way back when, there was this thing called the First Intifada among the Palestinians. It was a nonviolent uprising among the Palestinians, and it was giving the Israelis a very hard time. They didn't know how to manage it. And then just in the middle of the First Intifada, there's the Tiananmen massacre in China. Now, some of you are now thinking, okay, this is getting a little bit bizarre. Malaysian airliner, Tiananmen, what is this? This is beginning to sound like one of those 9/11 truthers. No, it really is not nearly as far-fetched. I think I could convince you in a half moment. So why do I mention all that? Because Netanyahu, at the time, in 1989, he was already a known politician. Netanyahu gave a famous speech at Bar Ilan University in which he said Israel's big mistake was when all the cameras were riveted on the Tiananmen massacre, it should have used that moment to carry out an expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank. That's politics. You look for those opportunities, and the opportunities are fleeting. Either you, as the cliche has it, either you strike when the iron is hot, or you may not have another chance. And Netanyahu realized this time that now all the cameras had shifted from Gaza to the Malaysian airliner, and he said this was the time to go in for the kill. We probably can carry out quite a lot of death and destruction without anybody taking much notice. And for those of you who care to look at the calendar, the night of the day that the Malaysian airliner was downed, that was the night that July 17th, that the Operation Protective Edge, the ground invasion, which was by far the most devastating, was launched. Already on July 7th, when the air invasion began, it was quite clear that this is not going to be a military operation in any conventional sense. This was just going to be a terror campaign in order to do what the Goldstone report said was the purpose of Israel's attack on Gaza during Operation Cast Lead. The Goldstone report said the purpose was to humiliate, terrorize, or to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. To punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. And that was the purpose of this latest round. Israel, from the very beginning, was deliberately targeting civilian homes. There's a report that just came out by B'Tselem called Black Flag on Israel's targeting, B'Tselem being the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories, targeting civilian homes, targeting businesses, schools, mosques, hospitals, ambulances, power stations, sewage plants, civilian shelters, and fleeing, and Gazans who were fleeing attack. There have to date been surprisingly few authoritative human rights reports that have been issued. I mentioned one a moment ago by B'Tselem. There's a second one by Physicians for Human Rights. It's called No Safe Place. Pretty grisly, or what it depicts, in particular in areas like Shujaya and Gaza. Anyone here Arabic? K-H-U-Z-A, how do you pronounce it? K-H-U-Z-A? Gaza. Yeah. My Arabic accent is horrible. As Israel carried on this wanton campaign of terror, it made its usual. Oh, I should also add that in distinction to the past, Israel has not allowed, with the exception of Physicians for Human Rights, Israel has not allowed any human rights delegations to enter Gaza in order to document what happened. So Human Rights Watch was turned away when it sent a delegation. Amnesty International was turned away when it sent a delegation. The Human Rights Council delegation, led by, but no longer, William Shabbos, they were turned away, which is very convenient because then in the future the only ones who can have documentation will be Hamas, and then Israel will say, and you trust Hamas? So you deny any of the reputable human rights organizations access, and then you pretend as if there's no credible evidence to document, to sustain the claims that war crimes were committed. As always, Israel claimed that Hamas was using Palestinians as human shields, and that's what accounted for the death and destruction. And to date, there have been several, there were of course journalists, reputable journalists who were in Gaza at the time, including from the head of the Middle East division of BBC. And they all attested to the fact that there was no evidence that Hamas was using civilians as human shields, But just as in Operation Cast Lead, the human rights supports have documented that Israel was using Palestinians as human shields during Operation Protective Edge. The purpose of the terror campaign was perfectly rational. It's not an act of sadism. The purpose was to break the will of resistance of the people of Gaza, or to turn the people of Gaza turn them against Hamas. You cause enough death and destruction, eventually the people come out of their dwellings, they see all the death and the destruction, and there's a normal tendency to blame someone for it. And the first person to blame, of course, after Israel, is to blame Hamas. And they've done it before, and it's a successful tactic. And so their hope was either to break the will of the people of Gaza at that moment, or later in time to turn the people of Gaza against Hamas for having created the catastrophe that ensued. By the end of the attack, 2,200 Gazans were killed. 70 to 75% of them were civilians. About 520 children were killed. About 10,000 were injured. And the destruction, a minimum probably at this point, they estimate is $6 billion in infrastructure damage. On the Israeli side, there were 67 Israeli soldiers who were killed, and there were 5 civilian casualties. The head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, he said after visiting Gaza at the end of the attack, he said, "I've never seen such massive destruction ever before." And this is somebody who's not alien to war zones. The head of the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, he said, "The massive death and destruction in Gaza have shocked and shamed the world." And probably the most compelling testimony comes from the world's leading authority on Gaza's economy, who happens to be a woman who's Jewish. She's a daughter of survivors of Auschwitz, and she's also a superb scholar. She's at Harvard. Her name is Sarah Roy, and she's written the standard works on the Gaza economy. She writes, "In the near 3 decades that I have been involved with Gaza and her people, I have never seen the kind of physical and psychological destruction that I see there today. The wounds of this war could prove too severe to heal." And the evidence, as I said, is that that's probably accurate, not least because nothing is currently being done to allow the wounds to heal. The illegal, immoral, inhuman blockade of Gaza continues. There were some surprises, good and bad, for Israel during the last assault on Gaza. It wasn't too much of a surprise that the United States gave Israel blanket support. Every day, the State Department or some Obama official, or as I prefer to say, Obamination official, would come out and say that Israel has the right to defend itself, as if that were the issue, Israel's right to defend itself. Even as the human rights organizations already the 3rd week in July, organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International They were saying Israel's targeting civilians, Israel's targeting civilian infrastructure. Those are war crimes under international law. And when Obama or one of his associates was asked, he just kept saying, Israel has the right to self-defense. Israel has the right to defend itself. The fact of the matter is that Obama was the enabler-in-chief of the latest massacre in Gaza. The reason why is not hard. No, it's not hard to figure out. The simple fact is that Israel had, from the day it started its latest assault on Gaza, it had wall-to-wall support in Congress. All 100 senators signed a statement supporting Israel. Even people who are so-called liberal, like Bernie Sanders in Vermont and Elizabeth Warren, made these hideous statements. Elizabeth Warren is supposedly the leftist candidate, and she was actually justifying Israel's attacks on hospitals. That's a low life. She ain't getting my vote. Not that it makes a difference, but ain't going to happen. And in order to stand up to the whole Congress, it would require spine, it would require principle, it would require courage. And those are three areas where Obama suffers severe deficits. And so he didn't do what was obviously the right thing to do. And though you have to add, he did worse, because there was always the option of shutting up. You didn't have to keep going out each day and saying Israel has the right to defend itself. There was the option of, even our New York is a Jewish town, Jewish power brokers, that we have a new decent mayor, hard to believe, Bill de Blasio. When the attacks in Gaza began, he made the usual remarks, Israel has the right to defend himself, the first day. And then he just shut up, which I could accept. I can understand if you have such big forces against you, and it would take a lot of guts to stand up to them. But that's not what Obama did. He just kept giving the green light for the death and destruction that ensued. That wasn't a surprise, but other things were a surprise, and they're actually quite significant. Palestinians lost all regional support in the Arab world. It was a first. There was a point, I'm only learning about it now, or appreciating it now. There was a point in time, some of the older people in the room will know, where the Palestinian cause had huge resonance in the Arab world. You couldn't do anything publicly. You couldn't do anything publicly that downgraded the cause of Palestine. At least publicly, you had to defer to it. And that was, referring now back to what I mentioned at the very beginning, that was one of the big problems Anwar Sadat had. Sadat wanted to sign a separate agreement with Israel, but a separate agreement meant abandoning the Palestinian cause, because it would have meant the West Bank and Gaza would remain under Israeli control. And Sadat began to panic, as it turned out correctly because he was killed. He began to panic. If I sign a separate agreement with Israel and abandon the Palestinians, I'm going to be seen as a traitor in the Arab world. And that's going to be my, in his mind, metaphorical death sentence. In fact, it turned into his literal death sentence. That's how powerful the Palestine cause was about 40 years ago. But things have drastically changed in recent years. First of all, Egypt and Saudi Arabia the Arab Emirates, they openly supported Israel against Gaza. They were calling for Israel to destroy Gaza. In fact, according to Hamas statements this past week, they claim, and the Palestinian Authority hasn't denied it, they claim that 80% of the targets that Israel used in its attack during Operation Protective Edge, 80% came from Palestinian Authority informers sending information to Israel. It's a very sad commentary, but the resonance that the Palestine cause once had enjoyed in the Arab world has now pretty much evaporated. As I said, Egypt and Saudi Arabia supported the Israeli attack. The Arab League met only once, and in its meeting, it effectively sided with Israel against Hamas. And the rest of the Arab world, well, I don't have to tell anyone this world, if you live in this room, if you live in Syria, if you live in Iraq, if you live in Yemen, if you live in Libya, Palestine is not a top priority item for you. The Palestine cause has been politically largely displaced and marginalized in the Arab world. You can almost say it's been reduced to its actual proportions, which is a secession movement. That's its size now, its political and geographical size. Once resonating throughout the Arab world, it's now been drastically reduced. It lost also a lot of support because this is when the ISIS phenomena emerged writ large, and it was very easy to assimilate Hamas to ISIS, to crazy Islamicists, jihadists, and that also subtracted from the reservoir of support for the Palestinians. Strangely, the strongest support for the Palestinians came from, of all places, Latin America, where almost all the major Latin American countries, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, El Salvador, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, they gave a lot of vocal support, heroic and courageous support to the Palestinians because there was no self-interest involved. They had nothing to gain from it. It couldn't be oil because, oil is the Saudis. It was just genuine solidarity. But the bottom line is, if we're honest about these things, in the latest attack, the Palestinians were alone and abandoned. The things that came as a negative surprise to Israel were, first of all, what came to be called the terror tunnels. The terror tunnels, or the tunnels system in Gaza, it was a quite sophisticated, ramified network, no question about it. It didn't come as altogether of a surprise to me, because anybody who's familiar with the Muslim Arab world, and I have a personal as against an intellectual connection to it, knows that 5 out of every 4 Muslims majors in civil engineering. So, yes, 5 out of every 4. I know what I'm saying. I'm trying to be ironic. And so you have all of these civil engineers in Gaza, and on top of that, they're all unemployed. So now you have 1 million unemployed civil engineers, and unsurprisingly, they applied their talents and their abilities and their training to building a quite impressive tunnel system. It was not vulnerable to air assaults or artillery attack. And it was also it was done with very primitive, simple instruments. For example, they needed a way to dig so that the Israeli drones overhead couldn't hear the digging. And they developed this device with a bicycle chain. I couldn't quite figure it out. Very simple, basic, but anyone who knows Gazans can tell you they're infinitely resourceful. They can take this bottle and this cup, and they can turn it into an automobile in about 15 minutes. I was teaching in Turkey this past year, and I had one Gazan in the class, and every time something went wrong with the equipment, I just, come on, you know how to do this, and it took 5 minutes, and he had it all figured out. And so they built the tunnel system, and it did cause Israel significant problems. There's no question about that. As I said, during the Operation Cast Lead, there were 10 combatant casualties, of which, as I said, 4 were friendly fire. This time, it wasn't Stalingrad, but it was 67 Israeli combatant casualties. They were having a problem. And the problem was these Hamas militants were popping out of the ground and giving the Israelis combatants a run for their money. Israel couldn't just destroy everything and move in. The tunnels remained. The tunnels were dug deeply enough, and they were strong enough, resistant enough, that they were still there even after the Israeli bombardments. What's not true is they said Israel invaded Gaza in order to destroy the terror tunnels. That's complete. They said because these tunnels were passing underneath the border from Gaza into Israel, and that's why they went in, because of the terror tunnels which had penetrated the Israeli border. It was complete nonsense, and it takes just 2 minutes of reflection to figure out why. First of all, on the question of the numbers, Israel claimed 31 terror tunnels were destroyed. Of those 31, they themselves say only 12 went inside Israel. But the more important point is there was a very simple way to handle that problem. It doesn't require any great knowledge of earth moving to figure it out. All you have to do is go to look at the lunatic regime in Egypt. So Egypt, as most of you know, it claims that there are all of these terrorists entering the Sinai through Gaza. That's what they claim. And it's responsible for killing all of these Egyptian soldiers. So what did Sisi do, the current president of Egypt? What did Sisi do? He built a moat along the border with Gaza, filled it with water, and that's the end of the tunnels. He didn't have to enter Gaza. He didn't have to blow up hospitals. He didn't have to blow up schools. I don't like what he did because a lot of people were displaced along the border on the Egyptian side. I don't approve of what he did. But certainly there was the option of simply building a moat along your border, filling it with water, and it's bye-bye tunnels. Is there anyone here who can possibly believe that the people in Gaza, who had only the most primitive implements, that they were able to dig deeper into the ground than Israeli earth-moving equipment? Is that really credible? In fact, just yesterday, the Times of Israel reported that Israel discovered a new tunnel, and they wrote, and we destroyed it without even going into Gaza. We destroyed it on the Israeli side. So then why couldn't you do that with the tunnels? All the terror tunnels that you claimed you had to destroy and destroy Gaza in the process. Well, the answer is simple. The problem was not the tunnels that were going from Gaza into Israel. The problem was the tunnels in Gaza. Because as Israelis like to say, every once in a while they have to go into Gaza and mow the lawn. Mow the lawn means destroy everything in sight. And they don't like for Israeli soldiers to get killed when they mow the lawn. And so they wanted to destroy the tunnels in Gaza, so the next time Israel mows the lawn, there won't be combatant casualties. The problem was not the tunnels that go from Gaza into Israel, which could easily have been disabled with a moat. The problem was the tunnels inside Gaza. That's what they wanted to destroy. Nowadays you hear everybody agrees. Everybody agrees. The EU agrees, the Palestinian Authority agrees, Egypt agrees, the US agrees. Everybody agrees that the construction equipment, if it's ever allowed, construction material, if it's ever allowed into Gaza, it must not be used by Hamas to build the tunnels. It must not be used. That's consensus. Why is that? Does that mean the people of Gaza have to be defenseless every time Israel mows the lawn? They're not allowed to have tunnels to resist a foreign invasion? Where is it written under international law that only one side has the right to defend itself? Even the tunnels that go inside Israel. So what? Israel's planes, tanks, artillery, at whim, go into Gaza all the time. So why can't Hamas tunnels go into Israel? I don't see the logic of that. Only one side has the right to defend itself. Only one side has the right to launch attacks. And in this case, it's the occupier side, not the occupied. Well, before the tunnels, as you remember, the big talk was those horrible Hamas rockets. The Hamas rocket attacks. Now, there were no Hamas rocket attacks. That's also pure nonsense. Now, I know some people are looking skeptically at that. Okay, this is one step too far. So let's go over the numbers, and let's see whether at the end I could convince you that this notion of Hamas rocket attacks was a complete fraud. First of all, let's start with something elementary. What is a rocket? At least maybe it's my generation, but when I think of a rocket, I think of something fairly formidable. A weapon, for example, that might stretch from the ground to maybe the ceiling. That's a rocket. In my mind, maybe that's quaint, but that's what I think of when I think of a rocket. Usually, when I think of a rocket, I don't think of a firecracker or something, a weapon the size of a pencil. That doesn't strike me as a rocket. That strikes me as a pencil with an exploding eraser. So let's go over closely the numbers and see what we get. Because there has to be, I had lunch with two very sophisticated UCD students who were talking about Schopenhauer. No, three. I have to include you. But you came late. He came fashionably late. So fashionably late that I left already. No. And they were talking about Schopenhauer and mathematical logic. So I know I'm dealing here with a very smart audience, unless they're not representative of the rest of you, who are a bunch of losers, and you were just sent to impress me. So let's look at the numbers, and let's see what we get. Let's figure it out. Israel claimed that Hamas fired 4,000 4,000 rockets at Hamas fired 4,000 rockets at Israel. I got the number wrong a moment ago, and there were 7 civilian casualties. The number of civilians varies depending whether you include foreign workers and things like that. But let's just say 7 civilian casualties. And they say there was $15 million in property damage. So I see we have an accountant here. You were taking the numbers, so let's put it down again. 4,000 rockets, 7 civilian casualties, $15 million in damage. You got that down. Good work. Now, we obviously have what's called a discrepancy here, or to use a fancier word, an incommensurability here. Namely, 4,000 rockets, yet just 7 civilian casualties and only $15 million in property damage. If one rocket hit this building, it would be $15 million in property damage. This building is clearly, this room would cost $15 million in property damage. So how do you explain it? Well, everybody knows the answer. It's called Iron Dome, that brilliant contrivance of Israeli Jewish genius, Iron Dome. And they said it was Iron Dome that accounts for the fact that's the anti-missile defense system. It's Iron Dome that accounts for the fact that notwithstanding the large number of rockets, there were so few civilian casualties. Okay, let's test the proposition. I see there are some people here who are glued to this demonstration, watching to see whether I can prove what seems to be highly implausible. There were no rocket attacks. So let's see. 4,000 rockets caused 7 civilian casualties and $15 million in property damage. During Operation Cast Lead, Israel said there were 1,000 rockets fired, and there were 3 civilian casualties in Israel and $15 million in property damage. By coincidence, the same figure for property damage. So, I'm going to look for a mathematician here, and I'm going to choose somebody. Okay, you. No, don't turn around, you.
Maths is not my strong point.
I knew it. That's why you turned around. I bet you can do it.
Okay.
Remember what Jimmy Cliff said. You can get it if you really want. If you try, you try, if you really try. Okay, now let's just get the facts clear so there's no misconstrual of my proof. Operation Cast Lead in 2000, is it 7, 8, or 8, 9? 2000s? 8, 9. During Operation Cast Lead, there was no Iron Dome. Israel had no anti-missile defense system. So, if 1,000 rockets caused 3 civilian casualties without Iron Dome, how many civilian casualties would have been caused by 4,000 rockets?
Four times as many.
Right, so, okay, I'm going to give you a clue here. 4 times 3. 12. So, 1,000 rockets caused 1,000 rockets caused 3 civilian casualties. 4,000 rockets would have caused 12. So what's the maximum number of civilian casualties that Iron Dome could have accounted for? What's the maximum number? 5. It turned out it was 7 that were caused, 7 civilian casualties. Had there been no Iron Dome, it would have been 12. So the most Iron Dome could have accounted for is saving 5 civilian casualties. But that's not even true itself. Because between Operation Cast Lead and this past summer, Israel had upgraded radically its civil defense system, its shelters and warning system. And so the 5 who were saved, it had nothing to do with Iron Dome. It was the civilian defense system. Iron Dome didn't account for that. In fact, one of the world's leading experts on the anti-missile defense system, his name is Theodore Postel at MIT, and he has an impressive track record way, way, way before almost everyone in this room was born during the first Gulf War in 1991. The big thing back then was not Iron Dome, it was called the Patriot missile. And there was all of this ballyhoo about the Patriot missile, which they said had an 80% success rate in knocking down the Iraqi Scud missiles. That was the figure they were using. Incidentally, exactly the same figure they were now using for Iron Dome. And what did it turn out? Well, Postel examined the evidence carefully, and he reached the conclusion. He said, at most, the Patriot anti-missile defense, he said, at most, might have hit 1 Scud missile. That was it. And now, Postel examined the data on Iron Dome. He said, at most, if we want to be very generous, at most, it had an efficacy rate of 10%, but it was probably closer to 5%. So now, let's do the math. 4,000 rockets were fired at Israel. I'll accept that figure. 4,000 rockets were fired at Israel. Of those 4,000, Iron Dome had an efficacy rate, maximum, 10%. So that means 400 rockets were detonated and exploded. 400 rockets were detonated and exploded. How many rockets does that leave? 3,600. Now here's the $64 question, as we used to call it in my day. $64 is a lot of money back then. Don't laugh, I'm serious. I'm still trying to earn $64. 3,600 rockets, but only $15 million in property damage. Now, you can explain the reduction in civilian deaths by Iron Dome, you can claim, or the shelter system, but businesses, schools, residential homes, they don't go into shelters. So the shelter system can't explain the limited property damage. 3,600 rockets and only $15 million in property damage? What's the only thing that can possibly explain that incommensurability? What's the only thing that can explain it? Can somebody call it out? Lies. They weren't rockets. They were enhanced fireworks. Unfortunately, in this case, it's a casualty for truth that both sides had an investment in this notion of Hamas rockets. For Israel, we're under attack, rockets, self-defense, and all of that. After a little while in Israel, it backfired because they didn't expect it would last so long, the assault on Gaza. And then Israel's tourism industry took a very big hit. And they didn't want to lose the tourism revenues. So the New York mayor at that time, Emperor Bloomberg, he went to Israel and he said, oh, everything is fine in Israel. It's beautiful. It's safer than any American city, which of course made you wonder, well, if it's safer than any American city, why are you incinerating and devastating Gaza? And then they switched to terror tunnels. And that way they have an excuse to destroy Gaza and maintain their tourism revenues. But also Hamas had an investment in this notion of Hamas rockets because it wanted to show that resistance works, that it was having a real impact in terms of this armed resistance to the Israeli occupation. Well, it's not true, in my opinion, but certainly it caused psychological disorientation in Israel, but in terms of actual physical damage, If you go on the Israeli websites, and you can check yourself, feel free to confirm it, and they show the pictures of the damage from the Hamas rockets. Apart from one or two pictures, but go look yourself, one or two pictures which showed buildings which were significantly damaged. Everything else was just windshields on cars and things like that. There was nothing, because they weren't rockets. Well, the whole thing begins to wind down on August 3rd. It was revealing exactly how it all ended. The Israelis, by the end, were going completely bananas, and they were targeting the UN shelters. They targeted the UN. There were UN facilities, schools, and other facilities which were converted into shelters. And they targeted one UN shelter, 2 UN shelters, 3 UN shelters, killing women and children who had been directed to these shelters for safety. And you could feel the pressures beginning to build up in the United Nations, like Ban Ki-moon, you wretched comatose puppet of the United States, when are you going to say something? And he stays silent, until finally on August 3rd, Ban Ki-moon, the pressure had, it was like a pressure cooker on him. He finally had to say something, and he described the last Israeli attack, I think it was the 6th or 7th shelter. He called it a moral outrage and criminal act. At that point, the puppet master had lost even his puppet, and that was a big problem for Obama. He was now isolated in the world. And finally, after Ban Ki-moon turned on him, Obama had to say something. And the same day, August 3rd, the same day, finally, the United States State Department, it called the Israeli attack appalling and disgraceful. And interestingly, it tells you something, a lot about politics, but we don't have time now. The Congress remained absolutely quiet. The Congress, which had been 100% behind Israel, the moment the US was completely isolated in the world and they knew the country has a problem, it can't go to bat for Israel anymore. At that point, even Congress shut up, and what's his name? And Netanyahu announced the withdrawal from Gaza, the ground invasion. However, it then lasted, unfortunately, another 3 weeks because of the negotiations, and also there was the ISIS beheading of the US reporter. Again, the attention shifted elsewhere, and at that point, Israel went completely insane. It was like watching a computer game. They were choosing the high rises, which housed mostly the Gaza middle class, the high rises, and one building after another were just being demolished to break the will of the Palestinians. And on August 26th, it came to an end. It's hard to make a balance sheet, I would say. Neither side achieved its objectives. The Israeli objective to break the will of the people of Gaza did not succeed. Its objective of inflicting a military and political defeat on Hamas, it did not succeed. Quite the contrary, as several Israeli commentators pointed out, Israel entered the attack on Gaza because it was enraged that the EU and the US were negotiating with Hamas. But by the end, Israel was negotiating with Hamas in order to bring the conflict to an end. So it didn't achieve its aims. It didn't eliminate all the so-called rockets. It didn't eliminate the so-called terror tunnels. The only thing it did was it satiated, albeit temporarily, it satiated the bloodlust of Israeli society, which seems to derive now just a certain kind of sadistic pleasure from the death and destruction that's inflicted on the people of Gaza. On the other hand, it has to be said that although there was the Hamas success was more successful in its military resistance than in the past, politically, it did not achieve any of its objectives, and it's foolish, in my opinion, to pretend otherwise. Hamas, each time there has been a round with Israel, it has always put one goal first. The one goal has always been to end the siege of Gaza, to lift the siege of Gaza. And each time they were promised, when the conflict wound down, that the siege would be lifted. Again, they were promised this time the siege would be lifted. And now we are, how many months? We're 8 months after, and the siege is as much in place as it was when the fighting began in July. So Hamas did not achieve any of its objectives. And I know, what time is it? So I'm going to just leave off with 5 minutes about what I think is possible and what I think is not possible about resolving the conflict. First of all, let's start with the basics. As a formula, how to end the conflict, that to me is completely uncontroversial. It's 2 states in the 1967 border, what's called the 1967 border, and a just resolution of the refugee question. Everybody in the world agrees on that except for Israel, backed by the United States. So I'm not going to even discuss what should the goal be. There is no break in that consensus formally, legally, in all political institutions, whether it's the United Nations, human rights organizations, judicial bodies like the International Court of Justice. They all put forth the same terms for ending the conflict, and everything else to me is just flights of fancy having nothing to do with the real world. The question is, how do you budge Israel? That's a real tough nut to crack. They are tenacious. They are tenacious, and they are, I hate to use a word that sounds like it's from Dr. Spock, but they're the baby doctor, not Star Trek. They're just spoiled silly, and it's very hard to get them to budge. There have been basically 3 strategies that have been tried. One strategy is the international diplomacy. And the international diplomacy is basically the strategy that the Palestine Authority or Palestine Liberation Organization would have pursued for the last 20 and more years, basically beginning with the Oslo Accord of September 1993. And international diplomacy, its cornerstone is, if we could show the Israelis that we pose no threat to them, if we show the Israelis we're happy to live with them, in fact, if we cooperate with them in terms of security, then the Israelis will recognize we pose no existential threat, and they'll withdraw and give us our state. And if they don't, then the world will see, the United States in particular, that we negotiate in good faith, the Israelis are acting in bad faith, and the US will put the pressure on Israel to withdraw. Those are the basic premises, and the basic premises, as everybody knows, are false, because Israel is not staying in the occupied territories because it fears for its security, and therefore all you have to do is make them feel secure and they'll leave. They're staying in the occupied territories because they don't want to give up the occupied territories. They want to keep them. And so 20 years after the process began in September 1993, there were 250,000 settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now the last numbers I saw were 576,000. They've more than doubled. I would say, looking at actions and not words, that's proof enough that this diplomacy thing will never work, because Israel is determined to stay, not to preserve its security, but because it wants to keep the territory. And the United States is not going to risk a frontal collision with Israel. Exactly why is a separate question. They're not going to do it simply to placate the Palestinians. They won't. So the international diplomacy strategy doesn't work. The second strategy has been the Hamas armed resistance. Under international law, they have the right to use armed force to end an occupation. So for me, that's not a relevant question. Of course, they have the right to use armed force to end that occupation. Not just an occupation, but it's a double criminality. It's an illegal occupation and it's an illegal siege of Gaza. So they have, in my opinion, of course they have the right, but the question is not whether they have the right. The question is whether it's a prudent strategy. Does it work? And I think all the evidence shows that the armed resistance won't work, it can't work, it's a dead end for the Palestinians. And then you might ask, what's then the only option? Is there another option? And I think there is, and the third option is mass nonviolent resistance, but mass nonviolent resistance that's coordinated with the solidarity movement in the West. If they do it on their own, the Palestinians are just going to be shot down. I mean, that's pretty clear. It has to be done in coordination with the solidarity movement in the West. If we give our all, obviously they're going to be giving a lot more than their all. Many of them will be giving their life. But if they can summon the internal resources, about which I'm pretty skeptical now, but if they could, then I think in combination with the solidarity movement, basically, my own view is the strategy that can be most successful among the Palestinians is the strategy that succeeded in the American South to desegregate the American South. You create enough national embarrassment for the government and international, because remember, our civil rights movement was unfolding during the Cold War, and it was just incredible propaganda for the Soviet Union that these black people were being beaten and killed just for demanding the right to vote. And that put a lot of pressure on, at the time, President Johnson to do something about what was happening in the American South. If the civil rights movement had unfolded in the American South and it was just confined there, if it was just confined there, there was no resonance nationally or internationally, it would of course have failed. The black people would have just been mowed down. It required not just the incredible, superhuman, really astonishing courage of the people in the South. That was a very scary place, the American South. As one person put it, that was mean country. I mean, the hatred of black people. It's not, you can't, for your generation, it's not even possible to convey. You just have to read about it and watch the newsreel footage. It was a very ugly place. If it had just been confined to the South, look, in the South, every governor, mayor, police force, it was all Ku Klux Klan. That was what it was like there, the white citizens' councils. But once you expand the arena, the courage of the people there, but then making it a national issue in the United States and an international issue, they were able to succeed. And I think the same thing can happen with the Palestinians. Right now, it's not on the drawing board because the Palestinians, in particular in the West Bank, are a defeated, atomized, cynical people. But that's the only way I see it can end. Thank you.